Buenos días. Muchísimas gracias.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Esteban, for inviting me again.
La anterior vez me tocó venir como candidato.
The last time I came as a candidate, fortunately we were successful and I returned as president. So I could not go back on my word. So here I am again. Thank you all very much.
Dado que se han cumplido 6 meses
Since we have been in office for 6 months, I think it is appropriate to do a sort of review of what we received and what we did and what we are aiming for. Specifically, when we came to power, without a doubt received what was the characterization of the most important crisis in Argentine history. We had a monetary imbalance that was at least twice that of the one before the Rodrigazo. This is interesting because when the Rodrigazo broke out, which was a crisis with similar characteristics, in monetary terms, to that of 1959, it implied a sextupling of the inflation rate. Therefore, at the rate that the inflation rate in Argentina was already above 200, it would be putting us at inflation rates, just for that effect, at levels of 1500. At the same time, we had an imbalance in the central bank that was worse than the one we had in 1989, at the beginning of 1989, prior to Alfonsin's hyperinflation, with the aggravating factor that the previous government had not only left the relationship of remunerated liabilities to the base 3 times, apart from a series of contingent instruments. The famous puts, which would have implied, in the space of a day, multiplying the amount of money by 4 or 5 times. In fact, the previous government's big bet was that we, taking our libertarian profile for granted, would want to free everything on the first day. This would clearly generate a monstrous hyperinflation, given that the social indicators were worse than those of 2001. It would have led to a brutal crisis, and in January they returned to power with all the liquidation and adjustment done by force. Faced with this situation, the flip side was that we had twin deficits equivalent to 17 points of GDP. Everyone who has studied early crisis indicators knows that 4 points is a yellow alert. 8 is a red alert before a tremendous crash, so 17 was a rather intimidating number, so to speak. Of those 17 points, 15 points corresponded to the national state, of which 15.5 were generated by the Treasury and 10 by the central bank. And at the same time, we had not only the problem of remunerated liabilities in terms of monetary base, which I just mentioned, but we also had the problem of the CIRA, which was $50 billion, and we also had trapped dividends. That is to say, we not only had a problem with the flows, but we also had a brutal problem with stocks. That is not minor, because the materialization of the stock, from one day to the next, becomes an insurmountable flow, and the consequences that a movement of the stocks, of these characteristics, can have on the exchange rate, could lead to an even deeper fall in the demand for money in a context where it was multiplying enormously, with which we would have had to face what was a real disaster. But not only that, we also had the problems of financing because we had internal debt in pesos for the equivalent of $90 billion. We had a foreign debt due for the equivalent of $25 billion. A large part of which was with multilateral organizations, but we had the agreement with the International Monetary Fund that had fallen through. And that was also interesting because when you have a situation of recurring default and, aside from that recurring default, one wants to renegotiate the goals, in that sense, in general. These reviews usually take about 3 months. And in our case, it was reviewed and approved in a weekend. This is interesting because the same people who criticize now said at that time that the program was inconsistent, not only that it was not inconsistent, but that it has proven to be truly successful and now we are going to review it. And, at the same time, the situation, in terms of financing, was also quite complex, because in fact the country risk was around 2,900 basis points and, in addition, we had an external sector problem. Basically, the previous government left us with negative international reserves, for the equivalent of $11.5 billion and a gap of 200%. On the other hand, in terms of activity, the beginning of 2023 had started with a fall and, towards the second half of the year, the government began to carry out a fiscal and monetary policy that was truly delirious. More or less, so that you have an order of magnitude, the previous government issued 28 points of GDP to finance the deficit. Of those 28 points, 13 were during the last year. In other words, it was truly insane, and that also shows the size of the bomb they left behind. But in addition, all of this occurred in a context of depressed prices, that is, there was strong repression in the price system and all the controls expired in November, after the elections. And already in December prices, in the first week of December, were growing at an annual rate of 3,700% and in the second week they accelerated to 7,500. The reality is that this was getting worse because in fact when one takes the wholesale inflation for the month of December it is 54%. This is interesting to note because wholesale inflation always precedes retail inflation and a monthly inflation of 54% annualized gives 17,000 and the reality is that the data for the month of April in wholesalers had been 3.4%. That is, 50% annualized. So it is quite funny that they say that there is no economic program when inflation dropped from a rate of 17,000% annually to 50%, and that is quite a lot. I know that they are consultants who are paid, but it does not go down out of nowhere. It is not an act of magic to lower it. And that, basically, is due to a tough stabilization program, which we carried out, and it is important to understand the logic of a stabilization plan. I understand that we have been through years and years of brutal interventionist brainwashing and, therefore, we tend to think of stabilization programs as a matter of defining a lot of policy issues and sectors and all those things. But in reality, a stabilization program has 3 elements. It has a fiscal leg, a monetary leg, and an external leg. In that sense, as far as the fiscal leg was concerned, what we had to do was attack the deficit. Knowing that the biggest problem was not in the treasury, but rather in the central bank, which was twice as big. And, in that sense, I took up, at least in discursive terms, the discussion between shock and gradualism. And the reality is that I was always on the side of shock, and I was unlikely to change when I was in charge of this ship. And I didn't do it, and I have an explanation. Because all the shock programs in Argentina, except for the one in '59, were successful and all the gradualist programs ended badly. So, the first argument was empirical in nature. The second argument is that to do gradualism I need financing, and the truth is that with the conditions Argentina had, there was no chance of getting financing. Therefore, even if I had wanted to do something else, I couldn't have done it either, but I wasn't going to do it anyway because I don't believe in gradualism. For me, gradualism is only a mechanism to make the adjustment on the political criminals slower. Choosing gradualism is choosing that the one who adjusts hard is the private sector and the political criminals continue to party, and that when the time comes when they really have to adjust, they don't end up adjusting either. Therefore, there was no chance of it being any other way, and in that sense we set ourselves the goal of zero deficit. That's also interesting because the goal of zero deficit was for the whole of 2024, and the truth is that we faced the adjustment with such courage, with such force. Since we made a reduction of the ministries by half, we eliminated transfers to the provinces, we eliminated them practically completely, we eliminated public works. We also eliminated a lot of political contracts, we made a strong fiscal adjustment. We also temporarily introduced the pays tax, which if the ley basis is approved, we will lower and then eliminate. And, in addition, we were clear that the adjustment was going to have a strong impact on society. That is, when you generate an increase in savings as a result of the adjustment. The flip side is that in order for it not to be recessive, you would have to have an increase in investment. The reality is that, with Argentina's reputation, it would be difficult to generate credibility overnight so that investment would take off. Even so, we sent a structural reform program to Congress, which is the ley basis, and, in addition, we sent a DNU, which they told us was unconstitutional and that Congress was operating, and the reality is that we already see, since they have been still discussing the ley basis for 6 months. Now it is interesting because that would have made the adjustment less painful, but politics does not care about that. What politics cares least about is the people. The only thing that matters to politics is doing business with the people, and that is what we came to change, and that is what has them so angry. Because it is not that all these things that we are achieving, we achieved them without the support of politics. That is, we achieved them despite politics. And they also told us that it was impossible. There are some who go around saying that there is no plan, that the worst is not over and all that nonsense. It must be that the dye is burning their brain. It is interesting because that same person said that it was not possible to adjust more than 1 point of GDP.
Ese mismo decía que no se podía ajustar más que un punto del PBI. Entonces me hubiera gustado saber cómo lo iba a financiar y qué iba a hacer adentro del Banco Central porque no tenía ningún plan para el Banco Central.
I would have liked to know how he was going to finance it and what he was going to do within the central bank because he had no plan for the central bank. Having said that, we believed that we were going to achieve it in a year, and, incredibly, we achieved it in the first month. That is, by January we had achieved the financial surplus. So, what they started to criticize there was that it was just something temporary that we had achieved in January. And then, they started saying that it was a blender, a lot of blending and scissors. It turns out that the scissors end up being 90% of the adjustment and the blender only 10%. So they lied there too. I mean, how could they achieve something that they couldn't do? They told you it was impossible to achieve, so they started to question the quality of the adjustment, and the reality is that 90% is a chainsaw and 10% is just a blender. Not only that, but we were not going to be able to sustain it, and in February, again, we had a financial surplus, and we were not going to be able to sustain it in March. And in March we had a financial surplus again, and we had it again in April, and we had it again in May, and when you adjust the seasonality for the month of June and you stay with the first semester, we are going to end up with a large financial surplus. That is to say, the zero deficit is not negotiable in any way. That is to say, they are going to have to take me out dead from the Rosada to achieve breaking the fiscal deficit.
No solo eso, sino que además nos cuestionaron el tema social.
Not only that, but, in addition, they questioned us on the social issue, and the reality is that, in terms of AUH, we are at the highest level of AUH in history. What's more, we also greatly multiplied the issue of the food card, the 1,000 days plan. And, in addition, we provided school assistance, not only in terms of school supplies, which was a very successful program, due to the number of people who received it, but also for those middle-class families who had problems covering the fee, we also provided financing for that. This is not a minor issue because faced with the problem that the drop in income implied for families, the fact of having to change the children from school, and the shock on the children is so strong that we felt we had to provide assistance. But as if all this were not enough, in addition, systematically the assistance only covered 68% of the basket, and today it covers 120%. In other words, the assistance is working. But in addition, there was a very important element, because it was repeatedly said that we had to end the managers of poverty. The intermediaries, and we made the first strong move, shortly after starting the government, which was a move between the Ministry of Human Capital, the Ministry of Security, the Ministry of Infrastructure. The first idea was that of Minister Pedovello, who basically decided to interrupt what was the accountability of having worked. Meaning that when you receive a social program you have to, afterwards, give an account of having worked. At that time, Minister Pedovello was punished very harshly for doing that. But that was fundamental to ending the poverty managers. That was the part that they were not seeing. Why? Because although people receive, directly, on a card the income, When they had to go to validate that they had been working, they stole half of it. What that did was take away the financing from these criminals. So, with the same money we were giving double the assistance to people. Apart from what was later raised. In parallel, as we knew that they were going to complain, we said that whoever cuts does not get paid and that the street could not be cut off. So, also, Drive. Bullrich created a security protocol and we coordinated this with the Ministry of Infrastructure so that, in the different means of transport, we could communicate and report those who extorted and pressured people to go to the marches. At that time, Bellaboni said that he was going to take 50,000 people when in reality he was planning to take 100,000, and something very interesting happened. Because only 3,000 ended up going and there were 12,000 troops, that is, there were more troops than people. And that also allowed us to meet another electoral demand. They asked us to lower inflation and end insecurity. We are lowering inflation, and that is where we began to put the problem of insecurity in order. Obviously, that was not going to be free, since today, the Ministry of Human Capital is constantly being torpedoed by this group of criminals. A group of thieves is moving, part of the agenda, and giving way to those criminals who we always said had to be removed from the scene, and now they are complaining, inventing a lot of lies. We found out that there are ghost soup kitchens, that is, soup kitchens where money was sent and they did not exist, or soup kitchens that said they had a certain number of people and it happens that, I don't know, they said they served 500 and, when you go, you realize that there was no room for more than 50. Not only that, but they also quoted bags of food that did not want to show the opposite, in terms of ID, of the people who received that benefit. And when you looked at the bags of food, they diluted the quality and took the difference. And, in addition, they were located near the places where the supposed supermarket soup kitchens were, where they sold these foods. It was a truly sinister business. So, of course, if you take that away from these criminals, they will kick up a fuss. The question is, but which side are you on then? On the side of Minister Petovello, who is fighting with all the crooks, or on the side of the crooks? Sometimes Argentina is a very strange country. Not only that, but there is also another thing that was very important, which has to do with the cleanup of the central bank and the situation of the exchange market. We had a deficit in the external accounts. We were losing a lot of reserves. We were $11.5 billion in the red, in net terms. In fact, the previous government smoked the equivalent of $45 billion from the central bank. So, the first decision was, sorry, now I work a lot talking, it is part of the job, and part of the job is also that I travel. It is interesting, because I hate to travel and, now, they criticize me because I travel a lot. I am going to tell you an anecdote, which is funny. I worked in a company, in a group, called Corporación América, and my job involved traveling a lot. Y mi trabajo implicaba viajar mucho, y yo odiaba tener que viajar tanto. And I hated having to travel so much because I missed Conan a lot. I mean, now I miss it 5 times and they curse me because I travel. I hate to travel. Pero bueno, nada, eso de vuelta, Argentina es un país muy raro. Si no estaría más cómodo. But, again, Argentina is a very strange country. Look, I wouldn't be more comfortable staying in Olivos. But they also made up the fact that I wasn't going to go to Italy. And poor Esteban was running after me saying that if I go, I won't go. Yes, I'm going to go to Italy, I'm going to the G7 meeting. So, they made up the fact that I wasn't going. Then later they made up the fact that, now, I changed my mind and that I'm going. The decision was always that I was going. Argentina is a strange country, especially with the envelopes of the journalists, who, obviously, rant all the time because we cut off their official advertising. In other words, it wasn't a campaign promise. It's another promise fulfilled. We cut off the advertising for those criminals. And let them compete, like all of you compete. Living off the state, that's not competing, that's living off the state.
Obviamente que los medios van a editar este aplauso y seguramente van a poner algo que sea un abucheo.
Obviously, the media is going to edit this applause and, surely, they're going to put something that's a boo. So, one of the very important decisions that had to be made was what do we do with the exchange rate? We knew that we could not release it because of the stock problem that we had on the central bank's balance sheet. So, the question was where to put the exchange rate. This was also a very important decision. I remember this decision because there was Toto, Caputo, Santi, Basili, Fede Furias and Martin Gutierrez. We were at the Libertador Hotel, which is where I was living, for 3 months. But it was great, it was the El Libertador Hotel, in other words, it couldn't be clearer, and it was also violet. In other words, spontaneous order never fails, guys. Adam Smith is always right, unless the government is involved. But I ask that you don't blame the invisible hand, blame the iron claw of the state. In that sense, the market consensus was that the exchange rate had to be at $600. I love it because those same people who said that we had to take it to $600 in their best scenarios, in terms of inflation, gave them a higher inflation rate than the one we had, and they are the same ones who complained about the exchange rate lag. They lost the argument so outrageously that, luckily, they did not mention the problem anymore, but they continue to rant. That is, it is not my fault that they use bad models and make mistakes. So, in that sense, the other alternative that the economic team had proposed to me was $800, and I said, no. Let's take it to $1,000. So, then they told me, no, what happens is that we are going to be charging the country tax, and what we were thinking of putting, at that time. $800 was correct and was the equivalent of putting it at $1,000. This is not a trivial issue. That was not chosen trivially. Because in that way, it resembled, in some way, the exchange rate that was in the market. What that was going to do was strongly reduce the excess demand for foreign currency. And by reducing the excess demand for foreign currency, what I was going to do was reduce the excess supply of bonds, which would have forced the bonds to recover and, therefore, lower the country risk. Something that until recently we had managed to break the 1,200 line, we were on our way to 1,100, and to break 1,000, but politics appeared and took it to 1,600. But don't worry because this is determined by the condition of intertemporal solvency and back. I'm not going to give up the zero deficit. So sooner or later we're going to break it. Apart from that, it meant that the fall in activity was smaller and that the loss of employment was smaller and that the falls in real wages were smaller and, therefore, contributed to not having a greater increase in terms of the poor and the destitute. And this is interesting because if the initial conditions were worse than those of 2001, if we made an adjustment equivalent to 15 points of GDP, In social terms, it would have been a catastrophe, and in terms of activity as well. Remember that, in the crisis of 2002, GDP fell 10.9%, but in the second quarter it fell 16%. We made a much bigger adjustment, and, even so, with a much bigger adjustment, the fall, in the first quarter, was 7%. And everything should be flying, in terms of a social disaster, and, however, it doesn't happen. And on top of that, they have the nerve to criticize Petovelo's management because it has a margin of error of 3 in 10,000. They have to be shameless. They take a medicine. They self-medicate with a margin of error of 5%, and they complain about the 3 in 10,000. Argentina is a strange country. Or it shows when the envelopes are not filled. That was also a super successful decision that was obviously heavily criticized. What was the downside? We bought $17.5 billion. In addition, we recomposed the balance sheet of the central bank and put the equity back in positive terms. It is important that you also take this into account, because now there are those who are beginning to warn that reserves are being lost. I am going to tell you something. If you look at the program, what do we have? It is a kind of crawling peg. That is, in the end, there is a kind of fixing the exchange rate and moving it at a certain rate. Why do I clarify this? Because if you are controlling the price, the downside is that you are going to have fluctuations in the quantities, so what is going to happen to you with the currencies has to do with seasonality. And the seasonality of the third quarter is that Argentina loses reserves in the third quarter. In other words, it is a natural result. In fact, the program we have in force with the fund estimates that we would have to lose at least $2 billion of reserves, but since we are overfulfilled in the fiscal goal, in the monetary goal, and in the exchange goal. So, we have room to lose more than $3 billion. Warning, because there will be no shortage of people saying, "Oh, the program is collapsing." They are losing reserves. No, it is a seasonality problem, guys. Another issue that was also very important is that the quasi-fiscal had to be lowered. That is, it was 10 points of GDP. And there was also a very, very brave decision on the part of the economic team, and the truth is that the management, together with Toto, Caputo, Pablo Cuerno and Santiago Basili, was very important. This is an interesting discussion, given my long-standing orthodoxy. There was no shortage of geese who began to criticize the lack of independence of the central bank. This is very good. Now, I don't know if, sometimes, they do it because they are clumsy, or they are malicious, or both at the same time. It is obvious that the directions were going to be interdependent. In fact, I will tell you something. In the cabinet meetings there is not only Caputo, there is also Basili. So why do we do that? Because, in reality, when we received the central bank was bankrupt. And it was bankrupt because the state had put a lot of papers in it. Or who do you think is the largest creditor of the national state? The central bank. In fact, I already mentioned to you before that the previous government itself took the central bank and defrauded the Argentines, because what it is doing is degrading the backing of the pesos that are circulating by $45 billion. So, if the state was the one that bankrupted the central bank, the logical thing is that the state puts the balance sheet of the central bank back together. That is why, at this stage, there is not all the independence that one would like.
Por eso, digamos, en esta etapa no hay toda la independencia que uno quisiera. ¿Por qué? Porque es el Estado el que quebró al Banco
Why?
Central.
Because it is the state that bankrupted the central bank. Once that is put back together, we can talk about the independence of the central bank. But those same geese are the ones who said in parallel that the assets that the central bank had are worth zero, that is. What I am saying is the inconsistency of the arguments. And in that sense, one of the most interesting things, because they're also the serial blunderers screwed up big time, was what to do with the interest rate and the issue of the remunerated. So, while conventional theory, so to speak, uses the interest rate to lower inflation, we thought of lowering inflation by lowering the interest rate. It was a very challenging thing. Of course, because we believe that inflation is, always and everywhere, a monetary phenomenon generated by an excess supply of money, either because supply increases or because demand falls. And that causes the peso to lose purchasing power and all prices expressed in monetary units to rise. Understanding that also helps us understand what is happening with the dollar. Because the dollar is just another price in the economy and it rises based on real factors or monetary factors. And you are seeing the exchange rate rise and there is neither a problem of increased supply nor a problem of falling demand. And this is interesting and also has to be internalized, is that we do not have a free exchange market. By not having a free exchange market, you do not buy dollars directly, you buy them indirectly, via bonds. And the problem with bonds is that they are not only used to buy dollars, but in reality, they are trading Argentine debt. And if you have a group of fiscal degenerates voting for crazy projects to break the fiscal balance, what you are doing is contaminating the instrument that you use to, indirectly, buy dollars. So, just as you try to undermine solvency and make the country risk jump from below 1200 to 1600, the flip side is that you are corrupting that instrument and you see a higher exchange rate. But it is not due to monetary issues, but to a group of gross thieves and criminals who only want to destroy the fiscal balance to overthrow the government. In other words, some destituents. In that context, for us what had to be done was to arbitrate the rate in dollars, not the rate in pesos. And, in fact, the initial evaluation jump, we had to achieve that the devaluation expectations were mapped with our crawling peg and with our inflation hypotheses. And that is happening. And in the middle of all that, as we were stabilizing the economy, an enormous task of Pablo Cuerno to reconstruct the curve in pesos. And what did that allow us? It allowed us to take remunerated liabilities out of the central bank and move them to where they really should have always been, which was in the treasury. Because in the end, what was happening? The previous government was running a fiscal deficit, filling the central bank with bonds, taking dollars, taking pesos, and as those pesos were left on the street, it took them out paying interest rates, and that is how the LELIQs ball grew. So, in that sense, if we had paid attention to what the economists said about raising the real interest rate in pesos, today we would have the relationship of remunerated liabilities at 8-1 against the base, and not only that, but, in addition, we would surely be talking about the problem of the carry trade. we would also be talking about the problem of the LELIQs and when the hyperinflation would explode. So, back to that, the market of analysts has failed again. And that is a valid theoretical discussion. From my point of view, wanting to control, let me ask any of you, what do you think about Moreno controlling prices? You will tell me that he is a caveman. Now you have to be fatally arrogant, worse than Moreno, to believe that one can control present prices and future prices. And the interest rate is that. It is the relative price of present goods with respect to the future. That is to say that when you control the interest rate, you are trying to control present and future prices. That is, those who talk about the rate and this are worse than Moreno, conceptually. And not only that, but they also deny the monetary nature of inflation. But what must be understood is that we must banish this Keynesian aberration that the interest rate is determined in the money market. That is, the interest rate exists because time exists, not because money exists. It exists because time exists. It is a mechanism of intertemporal coordination to take consumption from the present to the future, savings.
O para llevar la producción del presente al futuro, inversión. Y eso existe.
Or to take production from the present to the future, investment. And that exists, independently of whether the central bank exists or whether money exists. Therefore, fiddling with the interest rate is not healthy anywhere. So, that was also an important bet because we needed to decompress that source of money creation and, honestly, we achieved it because the adjustment today, in the central bank, is equivalent to 9 points of GDP and we have 6 in the Treasury. So, we are at 15 points of GDP. We made the largest fiscal adjustment in history, not just in Argentina, in the history of humanity, and we did it in 3 months. Nothing is impossible if you want to achieve it. And finally, in this, which I also find very interesting, is how long is it before we open the cepo? To open the cepo, what we have to do is finish cleaning up the balance sheet of the central bank. One of the problems was to finish with the remunerated liabilities. It is interesting, because today the relationship between remunerated liabilities and monetary base is 1.2. That is, we have 15 billion pesos of monetary base and 18 billion pesos of remunerated liabilities, with which we lower it to 1.2, but there is something that is more interesting. Of those 18 billion that we have of remunerated liabilities, 12 billion are in the hands of the public sector. Of those 12 billion, 7 are in the hands of the Banco Nación, where the flip side is that there are treasury deposits for 3.5 billion. Therefore, there are 7 billion of those 12 that are not a problem. In addition, there are 3 billion that correspond to the Banco Provincia, but since the communist dwarf generates a fiscal deficit, it has to demand a lot from the Banco Provincia, taking financing from it. Therefore, they are tight on liquidity and cannot touch it. And part of what remains is held by the city and a very small part remains in the rest of the provinces. Therefore, we only have 6 billion pesos left to end the problem of remunerated liabilities, and we have had tenders in which we have received offers for up to 18 billion pesos. This means that the Basili-Cuerno tandem has the remunerated liabilities cornered. And the other thing we are missing And this is one of the great perversions that the previous government committed and that the International Monetary Fund endorsed, is that since nobody wanted to finance the treasury,
es que como nadie quería financiar al fisco,
they preferred financing from the central bank, but they needed that not to be seen within the balance sheet of the central bank. So they financed it with contingent instruments. With some puts that are not even European, that is, they are American, they can be exercised at any time.
Entonces lo financiaron con instrumentos contingentes, con unos puts que ni siquiera son europeos, o sea, son americanos.
That represents, in accounting only the put is recorded. So you see there the number is negligible, but if that contingent is executed it becomes 4 points of the GDP. This is not minor because the monetary base today, in Argentina, is 2.8% of the GDP. And if you add the remunerated ones we are at 6 points of the GDP. This is important because so far, in the 21st century, that relationship has been around 9 or 10% of the GDP.
Esto es importante porque en lo que va del siglo XXI esa relación estuvo en torno al 9 o 10% del PBI, quiere decir que
it means that, technically, from the monetary point of view, we are ready to leave unless the puts are executed, which can be executed at any time. So, we are finishing with the problem of the paid ones. And when we finish with the problem of the puts, then we will open the trap, and this story of the trap will end. So, the reality is that the achievements are undeniable. We have brought down inflation, if you want to take it in CPI, from 25%, the next figure will be between 4 and 5%.
Si lo quieren tomar en IPC, digamos, del 25%, el próximo dato, digamos,
if we cut it in half, 4.5%, the core is traveling to levels of 2.2.5%. In other words, it is working. You are not going to lower the inflation rate by magic. If I take the wholesale rate, which was the one that was anticipated, we went from 17,000 to 50. I understand that 50 is aberrant, but 17,000 was much worse. And it also has other characteristics that I think are worth highlighting. In other programs that were very successful, before there was a mega crisis and much of the work was done by the crisis.
Hubo una mega crisis y gran parte del trabajo lo hizo la crisis
liquefying the monetary instruments. So the demand for money was all about rebounding. It was much easier to stabilize that way.
No solo eso, sino que además en muchos de esos casos
not only that, but in many of these cases they also violated property rights with compulsory bond placements. Well, why can't we determine the time? This also seems funny. You have to be too crude or very ill-intentioned. We can't determine the time because as we are doing all the operations on the market, it depends on the will of the individuals who want to make the different exchanges. Consequently, I can't determine what day it will be because it depends on the decision of the people. It's not about not having a plan, it's about respecting freedom. Bunch of communists. One more thing. In other programs there have been price controls. Here there are no price controls, they are free. And we are doing the stabilization, in addition, with recomposition of relative prices based on the prices left by the previous government.
Con lo cual, si quisieran ser honestos intelectualmente, no tienen que mirar la inflación general, tendrían que mirar qué.
So, if they wanted to be intellectually honest, they don't have to look at general inflation. They would have to look at what to see how the fight against inflation is going. The core, but of course it works too well there, and all those who anticipated the apocalypse, of course, don't get it. So, they have to wash their guilt. Therefore, the anti-inflationary policy is having a real success. In fact, when we came to power, 84% of Argentines believed that there was going to be hyperinflation. Today that number is less than 20%.
De estar discutiendo la hiperinflación. Hoy estamos hablando de créditos hipotecarios a 30 años y todo
From
eso en
discussing
menos de 5 meses.
hyperinflation, today we are talking about 30-year mortgages and all that in less than 5 months. Sometimes Argentines are very strange, especially those who depend on the envelope. Not only that, I warn you that it is not only journalists who depend on the envelope, there are supposed intellectuals who also walk through the channels that respond to envelopes, that is. There are professionals who are part of this setup, I warn you. In other words, the caste is not only the thieving politicians, but also the prebendary businessmen. The media and journalists who are stuffed with envelopes, but there are also the professionals who are accomplices of these aberrations. So, another thing that was demanded of us was to end insecurity, and boy are we doing it. Look at the success of the national government's intervention in Rosario. Yesterday, Minister Bullrich traveled precisely to announce the achievements we had had 6 months later, how much we had reduced the number of homicides, for example. So we were also successful there. Now that we are killing inflation, so what do they tell us now? Now they are going into hyper-recession. Well, we knew that we were going to have an impact on activity. But when you start looking at the data, today the diffusion index already exceeds 50% if you look at it for April, with April data. And when you start looking at it with May data, the number is still much higher. That is to say, the economy hit a bottom and began to rise. So everything seems to show that the worst is over, that we have found the bottom. And now we begin to discuss whether we are facing the Nike pipeline or we are in a V. But back to saying that we were practically going to destroy everything. Now we are discussing what kind of recovery. It is wonderful how in 6 months the whole discussion changed. So, that has to do with the short-term dynamics. As for the long-term dynamics, there is a very important role for what has been the DNU and what is the ley bases, which are things that make for long-term growth. The DNU is still in force, and if the ley bases is passed,
que son cosas que hacen al crecimiento de largo plazo. Digo, el DNU sigue vigente.
I remind you that the largest structural reform in history was made by Menem, and the ley basis is 5 times larger than Menem's reform. And if you add the DNU, which is working, we are in a reform 8 times larger than the largest structural reform in Argentine history, which was Menem's.
Estamos en una reforma 8 veces más grande que la reforma estructural más grande de la historia argentina.
So, really, what part is there is no program? We sent 1,000 reforms to Congress, 200 were thrown out, 500 remained in bases, and the DNU continues moving forward with 300.
1,000 reformas al Congreso. 200 las tiraron, quedaron 500 en base. Y el DNU sigue caminando con 300.
That is to say, even the denigrated DNU, as they denigrate it, is 3 times larger than Menem's reform. And if you think it is not valuable, ask someone who has to rent. With the phenomenal increase in the number of properties for rent and how, in real terms, the cost of rent fell. For all those who do not believe in the market economy, I would dedicate Maradona's phrase to them. But beware, there are 2. I refer to one that can be summarized in 3 letters, LTA.
Que se pueden sintetizar en 3 letras, LTA, pero
So, to the detractors, I dedicate Maradona's phrase. Now, what is the meaning of these reforms? These reforms, if they pass, would make Argentina climb 90 positions in terms of economic freedom.
Si pasan, harían que Argentina escale en términos de libertad económica 90 puestos.
That means that Argentina would become like countries like Germany and France, and the reality is that it would be a notable advance, but not enough for me. Probably. They are now degrading their economic freedom indexes, but the ideal was to at least resemble the first one, that is, Ireland.
Ahora están degradando sus índices de libertad económica, pero el ideal era
a country that was the most miserable country in Europe and today has a GDP per capita 50% higher than that of the United States. But the truth is that not even Ireland satisfies us. We have 3,200 more structural reforms to send, and if we do not send them now, we will send them, starting on December 11, 2025. That is, we are going to change Argentina. We are going to be a liberal Argentina, and we are going to be the most liberal country in the world, and in 40 years we are going to become the first world power. Thank you very much.